Should we start? Can I start? Okay, thanks for coming. This is an absurdly huge venue because I didn't think many people would come, actually more than I thought. But thank you for coming. My name is Arlene Archer. I'm the head of the Writing Center in the Center for Higher Education Development, and also head this group, a research group, which has been going for 10 years, called South African Multimodality in Education. And we thought, as a group, we would just reflect on the 10 years. We've just had a kind of workshop where we thought about where we're at now. So just to sort of give the background for the group, the issue of multimodal communication, we can't deny that is becoming more and more prevalent in the workplace, in everyday life, and also in the public sphere, as well as in higher education. For example, we all use PowerPoint in situations like this. We see more multimodal student assignments in the Writing Center, increasingly. Also in terms of increasing interdisciplinarity. So, for instance, you use film in history, for example. And this ability to read and evaluate multimodal texts has become a central part of what it means to be called literate nowadays. So this group it comprises something between 16 and 20 members. It's not huge. We're interested in how meaning is reconfigured in these different media. So we focus on things like the materiality of the media, the mobility of the media, what kind of audiences are we imagining, spaces and places of meaning making. So, for example, if you look at a paper-based comic, this is manga, as one of my students, in fact, as compared to the same comic on screen, the book as the object actually plays a role in the narrative. So as you turn the page, that's a kind of transition device. There's a time lag in the actual materiality of the turning. However, if you compare that to the same comic on screen, you find something different. And there's some kinds of constraints on the screen. So, for example, the page on the screen can't be viewed as a full image. Often it must be scrolled down, and that affects the flow of the reading. So a different transition device to page turning, scrolling down, offers other gains and losses, let's say. However, these online texts or online comics have other affordances. So you can, as we know, you can access other volumes of work, you can connect to different communities, you can also comment on the work online. So the point I want to make is writing and image here are modes, and they translate differently into the different media of page and screen. So just what is multimodality, since that's what we're on about? I'd say it's three things. Firstly, it's an approach to communication. It points to the recognition of the interconnection between different modes, for instance, the visual, the written, the gestural, the oral, and the spoken. Secondly, it's an approach to data analysis. So if you're doing research or empirical research in education, and you look at classroom situations like that, it's very hard to do just a verbal transcription of what's going on. You need to sometimes use photographs, videos, observations as data. But then what do you do with that stuff, and how do you transcribe it, and how do you analyze it? And that's where multimodal stuff comes in handy. So for instance, this is one person trying to make sense of a classroom situation. Really complicated tables, trying to transcribe gesture, all kinds of things, spoken language, pointing. Eventually she simplified it, because it is quite detailed, to something like that, and finally came up with her own form of transcription, actually drawing on someone called Sigrid Norris in New Zealand, where she shows gesture, the arrows going out with the hands. She shows language, but also intensity of language. We have many languages, different languages, and also showing the configuration in space of the bodies. So this is what multimodal data analysis does. Think about how to analyze these kinds of spaces, people in space, gesture, and so on. So that's the second thing. The third thing about multimodality, or aspect to it, is that it's an approach to pedagogy. So it encourages classroom tasks that require multiple forms of representation. And yeah, I'll talk more about that in a minute, actually. So just to sum up, what is multimodality? It's a practice. It's not really a theory. It's a way of describing or looking, or a domain of inquiry. And it's three things. It's approach to communication, approach to data analysis, approach to pedagogy. There are different approaches to multimodality. So there are three main strands, although there are others as well. But the main ones would be systemic functional linguistics, that comes from Halliday, conversation analysis, which leads to more like that transcription we saw of Sigrid Norris, and then social semiotics, which is the preferred theory of our group that we work with. I'll talk a bit about that. We find social semiotics useful, particularly useful. It provides us with sets of questions to ask of any text or situation. So that's where we see it. Not a theory, but a whole set of questions, which opens up a text or situation for us. So multimodal social semiotics views all learning and communication as multimodal and as deploying choices from a range of resources. For example, movement, sound, or layout. And we can think about, this is going to address the logic of space or the logic of time. So the visual functions in the logic of space. Gesture would as well, whereas other modes like writing and speech function in time. A social semiotic analysis focuses on the relationships between texts, social contexts, and social practices. And I think that's why it's so generative for us. You see, it's quite broad. So just for us as a group, it's about tools for studying, teaching, learning, and collaborative practices. So we're very keen on frameworks for describing meaning-making potential, writing, images, space, and so on. And we look at the deployment of these resources in multimodal communication, in particular in South African social cultural contexts. So the objectives, it's quite difficult to speak for a group of 20, but I do think we're fairly coherent in that we've managed to boil it down to, obviously they're very broad, so people can fit their individual research in. But we're thinking about pedagogy, about diversity and multilingualism. We're also thinking about research methods and theory and adapting and developing in the South African context. Crucially, in terms of education, because we are an education group, we're thinking about assessment. So it's no use having all these innovative teaching methods and pedagogies if the assessment doesn't follow. But how do you assess a three-dimensional artifact that a student hands in, or a video? What are the criteria? And it's really challenging to think through that. And lastly, to think about new uses of existing resources within our particular contexts. And our contexts are very varied. So there's people from health sciences, engineering, landscape architecture, and so on and so forth. You can see the rest. The jewelry pedagogy, people speaking to the engineers. You'll be surprised how generative it can be. Okay, and so that's in terms of disciplines, but the questions that we're asking around pedagogy are specifically around access. So thinking about how to facilitate recognition of the range of what students bring, especially say in the writing center where I work. Students can often talk very clearly about their work, but really struggle to write. So they're more proficient in one mode than another. But how do we recognize that and value it and draw on it in order to produce the dominant forms, so at the same time enabling access to these dominant forms? So that's the key question, I think. Recognition. So we take the position that making resources visible, or recognition of resources, is an important feature of multimodal pedagogies. Recognition is firstly about just noticing resources, what students bring, the fact that they talk better than they write perhaps, or that they come with a range of multilingual resources that they can use. So it's firstly noticing in terms of some existing framework, and then integrating the resources in terms of evaluation and application in a range of contexts. So what I mean by resources, I mean both the students' resources, including embodied resources. I'm looking at Aditi from our group at the back, which is drama and dance, as well as semiotic resources, such as color or recycled materials, or whatever people choose to make meaning. So the use of modes in classroom is always the effect of the work of culture, history, and power in shaping the materials into resources for meaning making. So recognition also entails recognition of how power is operating in these various social practices. So in a narrow sense, access is about trying to assist students just to cope with the discourses and knowledges of formal curricula and assessment. However, it also includes access to self-reflexivity, also access to a range of semiotic resources, to local practices in a global world, to the knowledge structures and conventions of different disciplines. So, as we know, formal education often closes down access to a range of resources, except the dominant ones. So, a classic case is children draw until they're about 8, and then that's not valued anymore, then they have to write. Whereas before that, they were encouraged to draw or work in that mode. So recovering those semiotic resources can also mean enabling access to power and to agency. So what's the theoretical significance around this? Well, we're hoping to develop multimodal research approaches, also enhance our own research capacity and methods appropriate to our context. So that's the one aspect, but it's also to think around pedagogies for our context, our multilingual and diverse contexts. And in this sense, to think about what we've called a reciprocal curriculum. So valuing the knowledge that students bring with them, at the same time thinking about how they engage with dominant forms and even remake or critique dominant forms. So just to sort of showcase some people's, I've mentioned landscape architecture is one sort of domain that someone's working in. In health sciences, it's patient information. The jewelry design, actually it was about how to assess a piece of jewelry. That was a PhD, very interesting and challenging. Also, what are the multimodal pedagogies or practices that are involved in becoming an engineer? Some of them are quite embodied, how to use the calculator, and so on. There's another member of the group sitting there looking at multimodal academic numeracy practices, museum representations, and a lot about digital technologies and online spaces as well. Also these kind of in-between texts, process texts, where you, which are not necessarily assessed, like mind maps. Okay, so just to sum up, I think the strength of a group is that you can apply for funding and you can be more successful in some ways if you have some coherence. So we have managed to get some lots of funding from the British Academy, from Sweden, from the NRF. We've also been able, as a group, very hard to do on your own, to organize conferences, seminars, and also attend as a group. And we've also managed to publish together as well. I think that's it. Yeah. So some other members of the group and our websites. Yeah. So I was much quicker, I'm sure. So I sort of gave you an overview of what we're hoping to do, but I haven't gone into detail into individuals' research. You could, I suppose, find that on the websites if you're interested.
Thank you so much. Any questions? Going on.
Get fit.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I was just wondering, what are your plans for the next 5 years? Where do you see multimodality going theoretically, but also in terms of maybe events and activities that you've planned?
Okay, Aditi kind of knows the answers, some of the answers to this. When we had a symposium quite recently, about a month ago, a lot of people were talking about decolonization and how does multimodality work with that. But I think as I've described it here, we have always conceptualized it as a social justice agenda, which is not necessarily the case in other places. I went to a conference in Germany where it was really just about dissecting text. It was less about context, more about text. So I think the challenge for us is to think, well, what's unique about the way we've approached this theory here? And social context is very important. So it's not about just text, because generally social semioticians like to analyze text and they're good at it. But the challenge is, how do you bring context in? So I think that's something we still need to work on. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
To what extent have various projects, have they been able to... Thanks so much. To what extent have your various projects been able to influence actual assessment practices, whether in the various arenas that they are doing teaching and learning, whether it's formative assessment or summative assessment?
I think, so the PhD in assessment has just been completed, and obviously that is based in an art school, and I think it has influenced the policy and practices there at Ruth Prowse Art School. But I don't think we've done policy stuff. That's a problem. So it's just research now, but not necessarily translated into sort of larger ramifications. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the presentation. My name is Bruce Clute. I'm working with Kate LaRue, and for me it's new getting into social semiotics and multimodality, but I'd like you maybe just to give me a dummy's guide to something that you mentioned here. Key question, in what ways can multimodal pedagogy provide the recognition of the range of resources that students bring? Can you give me some more on this, some more description?
I'll give you an example maybe, but it's not from engineering. So an example from English classroom. So this is my colleague. We actually, never mind. We wrote about it in this, in fact, this book is about that, this middle book. So sort of thinking about multimodal pedagogies in South Africa. It's all South African contributions. And Denise Newfield is the colleague. She looked at poetry in English classrooms quite a while back in Soweto, and people were not enjoying English, especially poetry. So they weren't enjoying actually critiquing poetry. I don't know if you remember from school, but each word gets dissected and try to understand what it means, and then you put it back together again. And they weren't enjoying the analyzing part, so they've changed it to production. So people would come and say the poetry or read it or perform it, either through singing or through a different mode, basically, and through more embodiment. And in this particular case, the students got really into it, and then they started writing their own poems. They even published a little anthology, but they still passed the exam. So it's like you still conform to the dominant forms, but you get there a different way. So that's what I think we mean by drawing on students' resources. The students enjoyed that, they were good at it, and it reinvented the dominant form for them in a way. And I suppose they may have read poetry differently as a result. Yeah. So it's just one example, but I mean, in that book we showcase different ones, like music, how music has been used, all different kinds of genres. The engineering one would be probably most interest for you, drawing and engineering.